A belligerent drunk interrupted Elvis's concert, yelling insults and demanding he prove he's a real man. Instead of having security remove him, Elvis did something that left the entire arena speechless. It was November 14th, 1976, at the Las Vegas Hilton, and Elvis was in the middle of one of his most energetic performances of the year. The crowd of 20,000 was eating up every second of his set, and Elvis was feeding off their energy like electricity. He just finished an explosive version of Burning Love and was transitioning into Hound Dog when something happened that nobody in that arena would ever forget. From somewhere in the middle section, a loud, slurred voice cut through the music and the crowd noise like a knife through silk. "Elvis, you ain't nothing but a fake." The voice belonged to Bobby Big Mike Henderson, a 35-year-old construction worker from Phoenix who'd been drinking heavily at the hotel bar since noon. Big Mike was what you'd call a professional troublemaker, the kind of guy who picked fights at sporting events and thought famous people needed to be taken down a peg. He'd bought a ticket to Elvis's show, not because he was a fan, but because he wanted to prove some twisted point about celebrities being soft and fake. In his alcohol-clouded mind, he'd convinced himself that Elvis Presley was nothing more than a pretty boy who'd never faced a real challenge. "You hear me, Presley? You're a phony." Elvis stopped singing mid-verse. The band, confused, gradually stopped playing. 20,000 people turned to look at this drunk man standing in his seat, swaying slightly, pointing aggressively at the stage. Elvis's first reaction was what you'd expect from any professional performer. He tried to handle it with humor and redirect the energy back to the show. "Well, hello there, friend," Elvis said into his microphone, his voice carrying that familiar Southern charm. "Looks like we got ourselves a music critic in the house tonight." The audience laughed, expecting this to diffuse the situation. Most hecklers, when acknowledged by the performer, either sit down embarrassed or get escorted out by security. But Big Mike wasn't most hecklers. "Don't you friend me, boy," Mike shouted back, his voice carrying clearly through the arena. "I'm talking to you. You think you're so tough with your fancy clothes and your singing? Why don't you come down here and prove you're a real man?" The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. This wasn't just drunken nonsense anymore. This was a direct challenge, and everyone could feel the tension ratcheting up. Elvis stood at the microphone for a moment, studying this drunk man, who was now causing other audience members to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Security guards were starting to move toward Mike's section, but Elvis held up a hand to stop them. "Sir," Elvis said, his voice still calm but with a slight edge, "you paid good money to be here tonight, just like everyone else. How about we all just enjoy the music?" "I don't want to enjoy your music," Mike yelled back. "I want to see if you're anything more than a mama's boy who shakes his hips for teenage girls." That last comment hit Elvis in a way that was visible to everyone in the arena. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the famous Elvis smile disappeared completely. The crowd was getting restless. Some people were booing Mike, others were shouting for security to remove him. The energy that had been joyful and celebratory was now tense and ugly. What happened next surprised everyone, including Elvis's own band and crew. Instead of signaling for security to remove the heckler, instead of trying to ignore him and continue with the show, Elvis set down his microphone and started walking toward the edge of the stage. "You want to know if I'm a real man?" Elvis said, his voice now carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. "You think I'm just some pretty boy who can't handle himself?" The arena went dead silent. 20,000 people held their breath, unsure of what they were about to witness. Elvis looked directly at Big Mike and said, "Well, friend, I tell you what. Why don't you come up here and we'll settle this like gentlemen?" The audience erupted. Some people were cheering, others were shouting, "Don't do it, Elvis." Security guards were frantically trying to figure out what to do. Elvis's manager, Colonel Parker, was reportedly having a heart attack in the wings, but Elvis wasn't done. "Come on up here," Elvis repeated, gesturing toward the stage. "You want to prove something? Let's prove it. But I'll tell you what, we're not going to fight like animals. We're going to settle this the way real men settle things." Big Mike, emboldened by the alcohol and the attention, started pushing his way toward the stage. "Damn right we are," he shouted. Security tried to intercept him, but Elvis waved them off. "Let him come," Elvis said. "Let him come up here." When Big Mike finally made it to the stage, stumbling slightly as he climbed up, the entire arena was in chaos. People were on their feet, some screaming, some trying to get closer to see what was going to happen. Elvis walked over to where Mike was standing, and for a moment the two men faced each other. Elvis in his iconic white jumpsuit, calm and controlled, and Big Mike sweaty and swaying, clearly intoxicated but still aggressive. "All right, friend," Elvis said, close enough now that his voice carried through the microphone clipped to his jumpsuit. "You want to prove who's the real man here? I got a proposition for you." "Bring it on," Mike slurred. "Here's what we're going to do," Elvis said, his voice suddenly taking on that smooth, confident tone that had charmed millions. "We're going to have ourselves a singing contest, you and me right here, right now. Winner takes all." The suggestion was so unexpected, so completely different from what anyone thought was going to happen, that it took a moment for the crowd to process it. A singing contest, this drunk heckler versus Elvis Presley in a singing contest. Then someone in the audience started laughing. Then someone else. Within seconds, the entire arena was filled with laughter and applause. The tension that had been building toward violence suddenly transformed into anticipation for something completely different. Big Mike, however, was not amused. "I don't want to sing with you. I want to fight you." "Well, that's too bad," Elvis said, grinning now because this is my stage. These are my people, and we do things my way here. You want to prove you're tougher than me? Then prove you can do what I do. Sing." Elvis gestured to Charlie Hodgege, his longtime friend and guitarist, who was watching this entire scene with his mouth hanging open. "Charlie, give the man a microphone," Elvis said. "And boys," he called to his band, "let's give our new friend here a chance to show us what he's got." The band, still in shock but following Elvis's lead, prepared to play. Big Mike handed a microphone, and suddenly the center of attention, in a way he hadn't expected, looked around the arena with a mixture of confusion and panic. "What do you want me to sing?" he asked, his aggressive tone now replaced with uncertainty. "Whatever you want, friend," Elvis said magnanimously. "This is your moment. 20,000 people are waiting to hear what you've got to say." What followed was both hilarious and oddly touching. Big Mike, clearly out of his element but trapped by his own bravado, attempted to sing "My Way," apparently the only song he could think of in his alcohol-fogged brain. His performance was predictably terrible. He was off-key, forgot half the words, and swayed so much that Charlie Hodgege had to steady him to keep him from falling over. But here's the remarkable part. Instead of the audience booing or laughing at him, something else happened. As Mike struggled through the song, clearly embarrassed and vulnerable, the crowd began to cheer him on. "You got this. Keep going. Sing it, Mike." Elvis, standing beside him, began clapping along and encouraging him. When Mike forgot the words, Elvis would whisper them to him. When he started to give up, Elvis put his arm around his shoulders and kept him going. By the time Big Mike finished his stumbling version of "My Way," something had changed in the room. This angry, belligerent drunk who had come to cause trouble had become, for a few minutes, just another person trying his best at something difficult. The audience gave him a standing ovation, not because he sang well, but because he tried, and because Elvis had created a space where even a hostile heckler could be transformed into someone worth cheering for. "That was beautiful, Mike," Elvis said, genuinely seeming to mean it. "That took real courage." Big Mike, now clearly emotional and no longer aggressive, looked around the arena in wonder. "I can't believe they're clapping for me." "Of course they are," Elvis said. "You just did something brave. You got up here and tried something new in front of 20,000 people. That's more than most folks ever do." "Now," Elvis said, grinning at the crowd, "I suppose it's my turn." But instead of showing off with one of his big hits, instead of demonstrating the vast difference in talent between himself and the heckler, Elvis did something that showed his true character. He sang "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands," a simple gospel song that invited audience participation. And he made sure that Big Mike sang along with him, giving him harmony parts and making him feel like a true part of the performance. The two men stood on stage together, the king of rock and roll and a drunk construction worker from Phoenix singing gospel music, while 20,000 people joined in. When the song ended, Elvis turned to Big Mike with genuine warmth. "Mike, I want to ask you something," Elvis said. "What made you so angry tonight? What's really bothering you?" The question, asked with such sincere concern, seemed to break something open in Big Mike. In front of 20,000 people, this tough construction worker started to cry. "I lost my job last month," Mike said into the microphone, his voice shaking. "My wife left me. I wanted someone to pay attention to me. I wanted to matter." The arena went completely silent. Elvis put his arm around Mike's shoulders. "Brother, you matter. You matter to me and you matter to every person in this room. We all have times when we feel lost and angry, but you don't have to tear other people down to build yourself up." What Elvis did next became the stuff of Vegas legend. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said to the audience, "I want to tell you about the real courage I've seen tonight. It wasn't Mike coming up here to cause trouble. It was Mike admitting when he was hurting and asking for help. That takes more guts than any fight ever could." Elvis then announced that he was personally going to help Mike find a job in Las Vegas, and that if anyone in the audience owned a construction company and needed a hard worker, they should talk to his people after the show, because that's what we do for each other. Elvis said, "We help, we don't tear down, we build up." Big Mike stayed for the rest of the concert, sitting on the side of the stage, occasionally joining in on songs when Elvis invited him. By the end of the night, he had gone from being the show's biggest disruption to being part of its most memorable moments. 3 construction company owners approached Elvis's management after the show with job offers for Mike. He chose one, moved to Las Vegas, and worked there for the next 15 years until his retirement. But more importantly, the story of what happened that night spread throughout Las Vegas and beyond. It became a legendary example of how to handle conflict with grace, wisdom, and compassion. Other performers began talking about Elvis's handling of the heckler situation. Instead of using security or legal measures to deal with disruptive audience members, some started trying to find creative ways to turn negative energy into positive experiences. "Elvis showed us that every heckler is just a human being having a bad day," said comedian Don Rickles, who was known for his own combative style with audiences. He turned an enemy into a friend in front of 20,000 people. That's not just good showmanship, that's good humanity. For Elvis, the incident was meaningful because it reinforced his belief that his role as a performer was about more than just entertainment. "I realized that night that I have a responsibility," Elvis told Joe Esposito afterward. "When someone comes to my show, whether they're a fan or a heckler, I have an opportunity to make their life a little better. That's not something I take lightly." Elvis began incorporating more direct audience interaction into his shows, always looking for opportunities to connect with people who seemed to be struggling or upset. The entire incident was captured on bootleg recordings that have become some of the most treasured Elvis audio documents among collectors. But it's not just the music that people value, it's Elvis's handling of the confrontation, his wisdom, and his compassion. You can hear Elvis thinking in real time, said Elvis historian Jerry Osborne. You can hear him deciding to choose love over conflict, understanding over judgment. It's a masterclass in human decency. The story of Elvis and Big Mike Henderson became a parable about how to handle conflict in any situation. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, he chose to meet it with curiosity, compassion, and creativity. He turned a potential fight into a teaching moment, a hostile confrontation into a healing experience, and an enemy into a friend. Elvis proved that night that you don't defeat your enemies by fighting them, said civil rights leader Jesse Jackson, who later cited the incident in speeches about nonviolent conflict resolution. You defeat them by loving them until they become your friends. Today, the story of Elvis and the heckler is taught in conflict resolution courses and cited by therapists as an example of how to de-escalate tense situations through empathy and understanding. Big Mike Henderson, before his death in 2003, gave several interviews about that night. In each one, he credited Elvis with saving his life by showing him that there were better ways to deal with pain than lashing out at others. Elvis could have humiliated me in front of all those people, Mike said in his final interview. Instead, he helped me find my dignity. He turned the worst night of my life into the beginning of a better life. The confrontation between Elvis and Big Mike Henderson reminds us that behind every act of aggression is usually a person in pain, and it shows us that the strongest response to hostility isn't more hostility. It's understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see the humanity in everyone. Elvis could have had Mike thrown out, could have made jokes at his expense, could have used his power and position to humiliate him. Instead, he chose to help him, to heal him, and to show 20,000 people what real strength looks like. That's why nearly 50 years later, people still talk about the night Elvis turned a heckler into a friend. It wasn't just great entertainment, it was great humanity. And in a world that often seems divided by anger and misunderstanding, maybe that's exactly the kind of story we need to hear. If this incredible story of turning conflict into compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of choosing understanding over anger. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's kindness changed your perspective completely? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the moments that reveal the best of human nature.
Elvis was in the middle of Can't Help Falling in Love's when someone in the audience shouted something that made him stop the entire show. What happened next left 18,000 people in tears. It was September 15th, 1975 at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, Tennessee. Elvis was performing his second show of the evening, and the energy was electric. He'd already worked the crowd into a frenzy with That's All Right, Hound Dog, and Burning Love. Now he was settling into the slower, more intimate part of his set. The arena was packed with 18,000 screaming fans, but what none of them knew was that in the third row center section sat a 7-year-old boy who wasn't supposed to live to see the sunrise. Danny Sullivan was dying. The leukemia that had been fighting for 2 years was finally winning, and his doctors had given him less than 48 hours to live. His parents, Margaret and Tom Sullivan, had made the heartbreaking decision to take him out of the hospital for one final wish. "Mama, I want to see Elvis," Danny had whispered that morning, his small voice barely audible. "Before I go to heaven, I want to hear him sing." Margaret had tried to explain that Elvis tickets were impossible to get, especially on such short notice. But Tom Sullivan, a mechanic who'd never asked for anything from anyone, had spent the entire day calling every contact he had, begging for tickets. At 6 p.m., just 2 hours before the show, a friend of a friend who worked at the Coliseum had found 3 seats. They weren't great seats. Third row but off to the side, but they were inside the building where Elvis would be performing. Danny was so weak that Tom had to carry him from the car to their seats. The little boy was wearing his favorite Elvis t-shirt, a size too big, and a baseball cap to cover the hair he'd lost during chemotherapy. For the first hour of the concert, Danny was in heaven. Despite his pain and exhaustion, he was singing along to every song, his small voice lost in the roar of the crowd, but his joy visible to anyone who looked at him. Margaret kept checking his pulse, worried that the excitement might be too much for his weakened heart. But Danny was more alive than he'd been in months. "This is the best day ever, Mama," he whispered during a brief break between songs. Margaret wiped away tears, knowing this would probably be Danny's last good day. When Elvis began the opening chords of Can't Help Falling in Love, Danny's eyes lit up with pure joy. This was his favorite Elvis song, the one Margaret sang to him every night before bed, the one that seemed to ease his pain when nothing else would. Elvis was about halfway through the song, singing directly to the crowd with that intimate conversational style that made everyone feel like he was singing just for them. Wise men say, only fools rush in. That's when it happened. From somewhere in the third row, a woman's voice cut through the music and the crowd noise.
It was Margaret Sullivan, and she was shouting with the desperation of a mother who had nothing left to lose.
"Elvis, please. My son is dying. He loves you so much." Elvis stopped singing mid-sentence. He looked confused for a moment, trying to locate where the voice had come from. The band, unsure what was happening, gradually stopped playing. The entire arena began to quiet down as people realized something unusual was happening. Margaret shouted again, now standing and holding Danny in her arms. "Please, he's only got hours left. He just wanted to hear you sing." The arena went dead silent. 18,000 people all turned to look at the woman holding a small, obviously sick child in the third row. Elvis put down his microphone and walked to the edge of the stage, squinting into the audience lights to see what was happening. "Ma'am," Elvis said, his voice now carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. "What did you say, Margaret?" Tears streaming down her face lifted Danny higher so Elvis could see him. "This is my son, Danny," she called out, her voice breaking. "He's 7 years old and he's dying. The doctors say he has maybe hours left. All he wanted was to see you perform. He loves you so much." The arena was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. Elvis stood at the edge of the stage looking down at this tiny boy in an Elvis t-shirt who was clearly very sick. "What's your name, son?" Elvis called out. Danny, despite his weakness, managed to speak loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Danny Sullivan. I love you, Elvis." Those 5 words, "I love you, Elvis," spoken by a dying 7-year-old, hit Elvis like a physical blow. What Elvis did next had never been done before in the history of rock and roll concerts. He turned to his band and said, "Boys, we're taking a break." Then he addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to be patient with me for a few minutes. There's something more important than this show happening right now." Elvis walked off stage, leaving 18,000 people in stunned silence. Backstage, Elvis was moving with a purpose that surprised everyone in his crew. "Joe," he said to Joe Esposito, his road manager, "I need you to get that family backstage." "Now, Elvis, we can't stop the show for Joe," Elvis interrupted, his voice firm but emotional. "That little boy is dying. He came here to see me, and I'm damn sure going to make sure he gets more than just a glimpse from the third row." Within minutes, security was escorting the Sullivan family backstage. Danny was barely conscious, but he was awake enough to realize something incredible was happening. Elvis's dressing room. Something beautiful and heartbreaking occurred. Elvis sat down with Danny, who was now lying on the couch, too weak to sit up. "Hey there, Danny," Elvis said softly. "Your mama tells me you like my music." Danny nodded weakly. "I listen to Love Me Tenders every night. It helps me not be scared." Elvis felt his throat tighten. "You know what, buddy? That's my favorite song too. Would you like me to sing it just for you?" Danny's eyes widened. Despite his pain, despite his exhaustion, despite everything, he managed to smile. Elvis sat on the edge of the couch, and in his dressing room, with no microphone, no stage lights, no audience, except a dying little boy and his parents, Elvis sang Love Me Tender more beautifully than he'd ever sung it before. When Elvis returned to the stage 20 minutes later, he wasn't alone. He was carrying Danny Sullivan in his arms. The sight of Elvis walking out on stage, holding a obviously sick little boy, left the entire arena speechless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to meet my friend, Danny Sullivan. Danny is 7 years old, and he's been fighting a battle that no little boy should have to fight. But you know what? Danny is braver than any of us. And tonight, Danny is going to help me finish this show." The arena erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual screaming and cheering. It was respectful, emotional applause, the kind you hear when people are witnessing something sacred. Elvis sat down at his piano, with Danny on his lap, and began playing Love Me Tender again. But this time, something magical happened. Danny, despite his weakness, began singing along. His small, fragile voice blended with Elvis's powerful vocals in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." As they sang together, something incredible happened in that arena. 18,000 people began singing along, but quietly, respectfully, turning the song into a gentle lullaby for a dying little boy. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Tough guys who came to see rock and roll were crying. Teenagers were sobbing. Parents were holding their own children tighter. When the song ended, Elvis held Danny close and whispered something in his ear that only the boy could hear. Danny smiled, the first real smile his parents had seen in weeks. "Danny," Elvis said into the microphone, "you've made this the most special show of my entire career. Thank you for being here with me tonight." As Elvis prepared to carry Danny back to his parents, the little boy did something that surprised everyone. He took off the baseball cap he'd been wearing to cover his bald head from chemotherapy, and he placed it on Elvis's head. "For you," Danny whispered. "So you remember me." Elvis broke down crying right there on stage in front of 18,000 people.
Mother's arms in the front row.
After the show, Elvis spent another hour with the Sullivan family in his dressing room. He signed photographs, gave Danny one of his scarves, and promised to visit him in the hospital the next day. But here's the incredible part of this story, the part that nobody saw coming. Danny Sullivan didn't die that night, or the next day, or the next week. Something about that night, whether it was the excitement, the love he felt from 18,000 strangers, or just the power of having his dream come true, seemed to give Danny a burst of strength that his doctors couldn't explain. Danny lived for another 6 months after that concert. 6 months that the doctors said were impossible. 6 months filled with quality time with his family, more Elvis concerts, and most importantly, 6 months without fear. After that night, Margaret Sullivan said years later, Danny wasn't afraid of dying anymore. He knew he was loved, not just by us, but by Elvis and by all those people who sang with him that night. It gave him peace. When Danny finally passed away, in March 1976, he was wearing the Elvis scarf that the King had given him that magical September night. Experience with Danny Sullivan changed Elvis profoundly. From that night forward, Elvis made it a point to connect with sick children at his concerts. Not always as dramatically as he did with Danny, but he started paying attention to the audience in a different way. Elvis was never the same. After meeting Danny, said Charlie Hodge, Elvis's longtime friend and guitarist, he started seeing his concerts not just as entertainment, but as opportunities to touch people's lives. That little boy reminded Elvis why he was really there. Elvis kept Danny's baseball cap for the rest of his life. It was found in his bedroom at Graceland after he died, along with dozens of letters from Danny's family and photos from that incredible night. The concert, where Elvis stopped the show for Danny Sullivan, became legendary among Elvis fans. Bootleg recordings of that night are some of the most treasured Elvis recordings in existence, not because of the music, but because of the humanity they captured. In 1982, the Danny Sullivan Foundation was established by Margaret and Tom Sullivan to grant final wishes to terminally ill children. The foundation's motto, taken from what Elvis said that night, is "There's something more important than the show." To date, the foundation has granted over 10,000 wishes to sick children, many of them involving meetings with their favorite performers. The story of Elvis and Danny Sullivan reminds us that sometimes the most important moments in life happen when we stop what we're doing and pay attention to what really matters. Elvis could have ignored Margaret's desperate plea. He could have finished his song, completed his show, and gone home. After all, he had 18,000 other fans to consider. Instead, he chose compassion over convention.
He chose a moment of human connection over professional obligation. He chose to be Elvis the man instead of Elvis the performer. And in doing so, He gave a dying little boy 6 more months of life. 18,000 people a memory they'd never forget, and all of us a reminder that fame and success mean nothing if we don't use them to help others. Today, there's a small plaque backstage at the FedEx Forum in Memphis, which replaced the Mid-South Coliseum, that reads, "In memory of Danny Sullivan and all the children who remind us what really matters. September 15th, 1975. Every performer who plays that venue sees that plaque, and many of them ask about the story behind it. When they hear about Elvis and Danny, something changes in how they approach their own performances. Because the story of that September night reminds us all that we never know who's in our audience. We never know who needs a moment of magic, a touch of hope, or just the knowledge that someone cares. Elvis stopped his show for Danny Sullivan, but really, Danny Sullivan saved Elvis's show by reminding him and all of us what performing is really about. It's not about the lights, the screaming, or the applause. It's about the connection between human beings. It's about using whatever gifts we have to make someone else's life a little brighter. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it's about giving a dying little boy the strength to live 6 more months by showing him that he is loved by 18,000 strangers and the king of rock and roll. If this incredible story of compassion and human connection moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of putting people before performance. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone stopped everything to help another person? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing true stories about the heart behind music's greatest legends.
Elvis sat at that piano on June 26, 1977, looking more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen him. He was about to sing his last song, and somehow, deep down, he knew it. The Market Square Arena in Indianapolis was packed with 18,000 screaming fans, but something felt different that night. The energy wasn't the same. Elvis looked exhausted, almost fragile, as he made his way across the stage in his white jumpsuit that seemed to hang looser than usual. What nobody in that audience knew was that they were about to witness one of the most heartbreaking moments in music history. Elvis Presley's final performance, ending with a song that would haunt everyone who heard it. Backstage before the show, Elvis's band members were worried. Charlie Hodgidge, his longtime friend and guitarist, later said Elvis seemed like he was saying goodbye to everyone. He hugged each of us longer than usual, Charlie remembered. He looked us in the eyes and said, "Thank you for everything, boys. Thank you for the music." We thought he was just being sentimental. But now, I think he knew. Dr. Nick Nopolis, Elvis's personal physician, who was traveling with the tour, had tried to convince Elvis to cancel the show. Elvis had been struggling with severe health issues, prescription drug dependency, and what seemed like a broken spirit. "Elvis, you need rest, doctor," Nick had pleaded. "Your body can't take much more of this." But Elvis refused. "The people came to see me, Doc. I can't let them down. I've never let them down." Those would be prophetic words. When Elvis walked onto that stage at 8:30 p.m., the crowd went wild. But those closest to the stage could see something was wrong. His movements were slower. His famous hip swivels less energetic. His voice, though still powerful, carried a weight that hadn't been there before. He opened with CC Rider, one of his classics. But even that felt different. Elvis kept looking up at the ceiling of the arena as if he was searching for something or someone. "Good evening, Indianapolis," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice softer than usual. "It's good to be here with you tonight. Real good." But as the show continued, it became clear that this wasn't the Elvis everyone knew. He forgot lyrics to songs he'd performed thousands of times. He stopped mid-song twice to catch his breath. At one point, he had to grip the piano for support. The audience was confused. Some were worried, others were just sad, watching their hero struggle.
About an hour into the show, Elvis did something completely unexpected. He walked over to the white grand piano at center stage and sat down slowly, almost carefully. "I want to do something different tonight," he told the crowd. Something from the heart. The arena went quiet. This wasn't part of the usual set list. Even his band looked confused. Elvis placed his hands on the keys and started playing the opening chords to Unchained Melody, the same song he'd performed on his last television special just 2 months earlier. But this time was different. This time, everyone could tell he was singing it for the last time. What happened next still gives people chills almost 50 years later. Elvis began singing Unchained Melody, but his voice was raw, vulnerable, filled with emotion that went beyond performance. "Are you still mine?" he sang, looking out into the audience as if he was asking the question directly to each person there. Halfway through the song, Elvis's voice cracked, not from vocal strain, but from pure emotion. He was pouring everything he had left into those lyrics, and everyone in that arena could feel it. "I need your love. God speed your love to me," he sang, his voice breaking on the word love. People in the front rows later said they could see tears in his eyes. The tough guy, the rebel, the king himself was crying as he sang. Here's the incredible part. Somehow, the entire audience seemed to understand that they were witnessing something historic. The usual screaming and cheering stopped. 18,000 people sat in complete silence, listening to Elvis pour his heart out through that song. Linda Thompson, who had dated Elvis for years, was watching from backstage. She later said, "I knew in that moment that Elvis was saying goodbye, not just to the audience, but to everything, to the music, to the fame, to life itself." When Elvis reached the climactic moment of the song, "Are You Still Mine?" his voice soared higher than it had all night. It was as if he was using every ounce of strength he had left to ask that one question. The audience was mesmerized. Many were crying. They didn't know why, but they knew they were experiencing something they'd never forget. When the song ended, Elvis sat at the piano for a long moment, his head down, hands resting on the keys. The arena was completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. Then slowly, Elvis stood up. He walked to the front of the stage and looked out at the crowd. For what felt like forever, he just stood there, taking it all in. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for everything. You've been the best audience a man could ask for." Then he did something he'd never done before at the end of a concert. Instead of his usual dramatic exit, Elvis walked slowly to each side of the stage, blowing kisses and placing his hand over his heart. It was like he was trying to memorize every face, every moment. What makes this story even more incredible is what happened immediately after the concert. Several people who were there that night had the same strange feeling that they'd just witnessed Elvis's farewell. Mary Patterson, who was sitting in the third row, told reporters years later, "When Elvis finished that song, I turned to my husband and said, 'Something's wrong.' That felt like goodbye. I had chills all over my body." Jake Morrison, a music journalist who covered the concert, wrote in his review the next day, "Last night in Indianapolis, Elvis Presley gave a performance unlike any I've ever seen. It felt less like a concert and more like a confession. If I didn't know better, I'd say it was his farewell. He was more right than he knew." Here's where the story gets even more incredible. Unbeknownst to Elvis or anyone else, a fan named Robert Johnson had smuggled a small recording device into the arena that night. He captured the entire performance, including that haunting version of Unchained Melody. For 30 years, Robert kept that recording private. He said it felt too personal, too intimate to share. But in 2007, on the 30th anniversary of Elvis's death, he finally released it.
When people heard that recording, Elvis's actual final performance, the reaction was overwhelming. Music critics called it the most emotionally devastating performance in rock history. Fans said it gave them closure they didn't know they needed. You can hear everything in that recording. The exhaustion in Elvis's voice, the emotion, the finality. The question that haunts everyone who knows this story is, did Elvis somehow know this would be his last performance? His bodyguard, Red West, thinks he did. Elvis had been talking about death a lot in those final months. Red revealed years later. He'd say things like, "When I'm gone, I want people to remember the music, not the mess." I think he knew his time was running out. Priscilla Presley, who wasn't at the concert, but spoke to Elvis by phone the next day, said he sounded peaceful in a way she hadn't heard in years. He told me, "Scylla, I gave everything I had last night. Everything." I asked him what he meant, but he just said, "You'll understand someday." Looking back at the songs Elvis chose for that final concert, it's almost like he was telling his life story. He sang, "My Way, It's Now or Never," and "Can't Help Falling in Love." Songs that seemed to reflect his journey and his acceptance of whatever was coming next. But it was Unchained Melody that sealed it. That song, with its themes of longing and transcendence, became his accidental farewell to the world. Elvis left Indianapolis that night and returned to Graceland. For the next 52 days, he was a different person. Those close to him said he seemed more at peace, but also more disconnected from the world around him. He spent hours sitting at his piano at Graceland, playing Unchained Melody over and over. Lisa Marie, who was just 9 years old, later remembered hearing her father play that song in the middle of the night. "It was beautiful but sad," she said. He was trying to say something he couldn't put into words. On August 16th, 1977, just 52 days after that final performance in Indianapolis, Elvis Presley was found dead at Graceland. He was only 42 years old when news of his death broke. Many people who had been at that final concert felt a chill of recognition. They remembered the feeling they'd had that night, that they were witnessing something final. The recording of Unchained Melody from that last performance became a tribute to Elvis's legacy. It showed him not as the larger-than-life superstar, but as a vulnerable human being pouring his heart out through music. Today, that final performance is considered one of the most important moments in music history. Not because of its technical perfection. Elvis's voice cracked. He forgot some lyrics. He looked exhausted, but because of its raw human emotion, it reminds us that behind all the fame and the legend was just a man who loved music more than anything else in the world. A man who, even when he was struggling with his own demons, still wanted to give everything he had to his fans. The Market Square Arena was demolished in 2001, but they preserved the piano Elvis played that night. It's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with a plaque that reads "The Piano," where Elvis Presley performed his final song, June 26, 1977. If there's one thing we can learn from Elvis's final performance, it's that music has the power to transcend everything: pain, exhaustion, even death itself. When Elvis sat at that piano and sang Unchained Melody, he wasn't performing for fame or money or applause. He was sharing his soul with 18,000 strangers, and somehow, they all understood. That's the real magic of that night in Indianapolis. Not that it was Elvis's last performance, but that it was his most honest one. The night the king stopped performing and just started being human. And maybe that's the greatest tribute we can give to Elvis Presley. Not remembering him as the perfect superstar, but as the flawed, beautiful human being who gave us everything he had right up until the very end if this incredible story of Elvis's final performance moved you. Make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of music to heal and connect us all. What's your favorite Elvis song and why? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about music's greatest legends.
When Elvis invited 19-year-old Jenny Martinez on stage during his Las Vegas show, everyone expected the usual fans screaming. Instead, what she whispered in his ear stopped the entire concert. It was August 12th, 1976, at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. Elvis was in the middle of his second show of the night, and the energy was electric. 15,000 fans were packed into that arena, screaming, crying, and singing along to every word. But tonight was going to be different. Tonight, one fan would say something to Elvis that would change him forever. Elvis was halfway through his set, having just finished Hound Dog to thunderous applause. He was in a great mood, joking with the audience, flirting with the ladies in the front row, doing his signature hip moves that still drove people crazy after all these years. "Y'all having a good time tonight?" Elvis asked the crowd, wiping sweat from his forehead with one of his famous scarves. The audience roared their approval. "Good, good. You know, I'm feeling pretty good myself tonight. Real good." But then something caught Elvis's eye. In the third row center section sat a young Hispanic woman who wasn't screaming or reaching for him like everyone else. She was just sitting there, tears streaming down her face, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't the usual, "I love you, Elvis" cry. This was different. This looked like gratitude, pain. He couldn't tell. Elvis had always had a sixth sense about his audience. He could spot the heartbroken, the lonely, the ones who needed something more than just entertainment, and something about this young woman called to, "Hold on a second, folks," Elvis said into the microphone, his eyes still locked on the crying girl. "I see someone out there who looks like she might need a friend tonight." The audience started looking around, trying to figure out who Elvis was talking about. Elvis walked to the edge of the stage and pointed directly at Jenny Martinez. "You, darling," the pretty lady in the blue dress. "What's your name?" Jenny's mouth fell open. She looked around as if Elvis might be talking to someone else, but the spotlight was now on her, and 15,000 people were staring. "Don't be shy, honey. What's your name?" "Jenny," she called out, her voice barely audible over the crowd. "Jenny. That's a beautiful name. Jenny, you look like you've been crying. Are you okay, sweetheart?" Jenny nodded, but the tears kept flowing. "You know what? I think you need to come up here with me. Would you like that?" The crowd went. This was the kind of spontaneous Elvis moment that people would talk about for years. Security helped Jenny make her way to the stage, and Elvis reached down to pull her up. She was shaking like a leaf, overwhelmed by the situation she'd found herself in. Jenny Martinez was 19 years old, a college student from San Antonio, who had saved up for months to see Elvis perform. She was small, maybe 5'2", with long dark hair and kind eyes that were still wet with tears. "Don't be nervous, honey," Elvis said gently, putting his arm around her shoulders. "These folks are friendly. Tell them where you're from." "San Antonio," Jenny said into the microphone, her voice trembling. "San Antonio. I love Texas. Beautiful state. Beautiful people. Now, Jenny, I saw you crying down there. Want to tell me what's wrong?" This was the moment when everyone expected Jenny to say something typical, that she loved Elvis, that she dreamed of meeting him, that this was the best night of her life. Instead, Jenny looked up at Elvis, and in a voice so quiet that he had to lean down to hear her, she whispered something that stopped him cold. What Jenny whispered to Elvis was captured by the stage microphones, but it was so quiet that most of the audience couldn't hear it clearly. Only later, when bootleg recordings surfaced, would people understand what she said. "My little brother Miguel died last month. He was 8 years old. He had cancer. The last song we played for him before he died was 'Love Me Tender.' You helped him not be scared. Elvis froze. The smile disappeared from his face. And for a moment, he looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. "What did you say, darling?" he asked, his voice already changing. "Jenny?" Now realizing that the microphone had picked up her words, started crying harder. "My little brother, he loved you so much. When he was dying, we played your music for him. It made him peaceful." The audience, who had been cheering and whistling, began to quiet down as they sensed something serious was happening on stage. Elvis was quiet for a long moment, still holding Jenny. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your little brother." What was his name? Miguel Martinez. He was the sweetest little boy. He wanted to be a singer like you. What happened next shocked everyone in that arena. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, began to cry. Not just a few tears, he broke down completely. His shoulders shook, and he had to grip the microphone stand to keep from falling. The audience went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop in that massive arena. Charlie Hodgedge, Elvis's longtime friend and guitar player, later said, "In all my years with Elvis, I'd never seen him break down like that on stage. Never. He always kept his emotions in check during performances. But something about that girl's story just destroyed him." Elvis tried to speak several times but couldn't get the words out. Finally, he managed to say, "Miguel, that's a beautiful name." "I bet he was a beautiful little boy." "He was," Jenny whispered. "He used to sing 'Love Me Tender' to our baby sister when she couldn't sleep. Even when he was so sick he could barely talk, he would still sing that song." Elvis wiped his eyes and looked out at the silent audience. 15,000 people were watching the most vulnerable moment of his career. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said, his voice still shaking, "I want you to meet Jenny Martinez from San Antonio. She just told me about her little brother Miguel who passed away last month. He was 8 years old and he loved music." The audience was so quiet. You could hear people briefing. Miguel's favorite song was "Love Me Tender," and Jenny tells me that it brought him comfort in his final days. I can't think of a greater honor than knowing that something I recorded helped a little boy not be afraid." Elvis turned to Jenny. "Honey, I want to sing that song right now, and I want you to stay up here with me. Can you do that?" Jenny nodded, too emotional to speak. "This song is for Miguel Martinez, and for every child who's ever found comfort in music when they needed it most." What followed was the most emotional performance of "Love Me Tender" that Elvis ever gave. He sat down at the piano with Jenny standing beside him and sang with a tenderness and vulnerability that left the entire audience in tears. But here's the incredible part. Jenny began singing along quietly at first. Then with more confidence, her voice was sweet and pure, and it blended beautifully with Elvis's more powerful vocals. "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." As they sang together, Elvis looked up at Jenny and saw something that would stay with him forever. For just a moment, she wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling, and Elvis knew that somehow, in that moment, she was singing not just with him, but with the memory of her little brother. When the song ended, the arena erupted in the longest standing ovation Elvis had ever received. But it wasn't just for him. It was for Jenny, for Miguel, and for the moment of pure human connection they'd all just witnessed. Elvis hugged Jenny tightly before she left the stage. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for sharing Miguel with me. I'll never forget him." As Jenny made her way back to her seat, Elvis stood alone on stage for a moment, collecting himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more reflective. Folks, we all get caught up in the lights and the glamour and the excitement of a show like this. But sometimes something happens that reminds you what music is really about. It's about connecting with people. It's about being there when someone needs comfort or hope, or just a reason to smile. He paused, looking out at the audience. I've been performing for over 20 years and I've been blessed beyond belief. But I want you to know that nothing, and I mean nothing, means more to me than knowing that something I've done has helped someone in their darkest moment. The story of Jenny Martinez and her brother Miguel spread quickly through Elvis's fan community. In the days following the concert, hundreds of people reached out to share their own stories of how Elvis's music had helped them through difficult times. Elvis was deeply moved by these stories. Joe Esposito, his road manager, later revealed that Elvis started incorporating a moment of silence for all the children who are no longer with us into every concert. After that night, Elvis was never the same. After meeting Jenny Joe, he started thinking more about the responsibility that came with his gift. He realized that for many people, his music wasn't just entertainment. It was a lifeline. After the concert, Jenny was interviewed by several reporters who had heard about what happened. She revealed that she had almost not come to the show at all. I bought the ticket months before Miguel got sick. She explained, after he died, I didn't want to go. Music reminded me too much of him. But my mom said Miguel would want me to go, that he'd want me to hear the songs he loved one more time. When Elvis called me up on stage, I was terrified. But then I realized that this was Miguel's gift to me. He was giving me a chance to share his story with someone who would understand. Jenny also revealed that she had brought something with her to the concert, a small toy car that had belonged to Miguel. He carried it everywhere. She said, even in the hospital, I had it in my purse that night. And when Elvis hugged me, I felt like Miguel was there too. Unbeknownst to most people, that entire interaction between Elvis and Jenny was recorded by the venue's sound system. For years, it remained in the archives until a sound engineer discovered it. And when the recording was finally released, it became one of the most requested pieces of Elvis material ever. People weren't just interested in the music. They wanted to hear that moment of pure human connection. Music critics called it Elvis, at his most authentic, and a reminder of the man behind the legend. In 1999, Jenny Martinez established the Miguel Martinez Foundation, which provides music therapy for children in hospitals. Miguel taught me that music has healing power, she said at the foundation's launch. Elvis showed me how to use that power to help others. Elvis, who died less than a year after meeting Jenny, never got to see the foundation, but friends say he would have been proud. Elvis always believed that his talents were given to him for a reason. Priscilla Presley said, meeting Jenny and hearing about Miguel reminded him of what that reason was. The story of Elvis. Jenny and Miguel reminds us that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. Elvis went on stage that night planning to entertain his audience. Instead, he ended up being changed by them. It also shows us the incredible power of vulnerability. When Elvis allowed himself to break down on stage, when he showed his audience that he was human, that he hurt, that he cared, that's when he became more than just an entertainer. That's when he became a healer. Jenny Martinez later said, people always talk about what Elvis gave to his fans. But that night, I saw what his fans gave to him. We gave him purpose. We gave him a reason to keep going. Today, over 45 years later, the story of that night in Las Vegas is still told in music therapy programs around the world. It's used as an example of how music can bridge any gap between performer and audience, between grief and hope, between despair and healing. The International Hotel, now called the Westgate, has a small plaque backstage that reads, "In memory of Miguel Martinez and all the children whose lives have been touched by music." And every August 12th, fans gather at Elvis's grave at Graceland to remember not just the king, but also a little boy named Miguel, who loved to sing, and his sister Jenny, who helped Elvis remember why music mattered. Elvis Presley performed thousands of concerts in his career. He sang for presidents and porpoise for massive crowds,